my fellow Americans, are we reaping our harvest of greed? Have we built our house on sinking sand? Why are we being ugly Americans? Call it the ballad of the battle.
There's been no major criminal prosecutions of the major players on Wall Street, and I exclude Bernie Madoff from that list. My guest today, Professor William Black of the University of Missouri at Kansas City, said the reason is there's an immunity doctrine, and it begins at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Professor Black, what do you mean? What is the immunity doctrine that you speak of?
You're right to exclude Madoff. What we're talking about is there is not a single senior official of the major non-prime players that caused this crisis that has been prosecuted. And, of course, therefore, none has been convicted.
Right. So why is that? Why haven't there been prosecutions? Is it a matter that, as some people suggest, that what they did, although it was disgusting, was actually legal? Or was there actual illegality and criminal conduct?
Well, we know that there was massive illegality. That's what the FBI was talking about, that there was an epidemic of fraud. And the fraud overwhelmingly took the context of liar's loans. Now, whatever people imagine about the Community Reinvestment Act, it has nothing to do with liar's loans. Liar's loans, nobody put a gun to the head of any lender and said, you should be making liar's loans. They decided to do that. And they knew, and we've known for centuries, that if you don't do underwriting, and that's what a liar's loan is, you will create massive adverse selection and that you will have a negative expected value of lending. In plain English, that means you will lose money. Honest lenders don't do that. If you make these kinds of loans, in the short term, you are guaranteed to report record fictional profits. Of course, you create record real losses. And with modern executive compensation, that means you walk away rich. Then what happened? Well, then we bailed the folks out. And then we had the largest, most prestigious entities in America, and indeed the world, places like Bank of America say, you know what we should do? We should have our loans serviced by Countrywide, because those Countrywide people have spent the last 6 years learning how to create fraudulent loans. That's a great business idea. And you know who did that before? Well, the folks that acquired AmeriQuest when 49 state attorney generals sued them for fraud and predatory lending, and the FTC sued them. And what happened? Well, Citicorp and WAMU said, those are the kinds of employees we want. And so they rushed to acquire them and created the new fraudulent lines. The underlying mortgage fraud leads to the servicing fraud. It has to, because the documents often don't exist. And so people who want to foreclose have to lie about it, which they did to the tune of 10,000 times a month.
Right. And
those are felonies.
Right. And we're seeing the same kind of activity going on in the foreclosure process. So you lie about the origination during the servicing and during the foreclosure. And we saw last week when Bank of America reported its results, it's still dealing with the aftermath of this. And I know you think that there are still major problems in the financial sector because of this. Do you think we're going to get to a point where the American people or some of our elected officials are going to say, you know what, we need to prosecute some of these people?
It's going to have to come from the people because it isn't coming from our government, any element. So the key to the foreclosure frauds is the same as the underlying frauds, accounting and securities fraud by the lenders. And that is the dog that aren't barking. The regulators are still rushing to try to prevent effective action against foreclosure fraud. What you're seeing with this settlement agreement with the banking regulatory agencies is a conscious effort to undercut the state attorney generals. Right. So the state attorney generals probably aren't going to do criminal charges against major officials. At least that's the buzz out of it as well, because they don't have the resources.
If fish rots from the head, is it the policy of the Obama administration and Tim Geithner at Treasury and the head of the SEC to not go after these criminals or what you're accusing of criminal deeds?
It's the unofficial policy of the United States. It's never going to be put in writing because that would be deeply embarrassing. But the de facto policy right now is elite frauds go free if they're in banking because the whole sector is too fragile. And that is significantly insane. It will produce the next crisis. It'll make the next crisis come sooner, and it'll make the next crisis far, far worse. And you see every time you fail to root out the frauds, the fraud simply migrates. It migrates from the lending process to the foreclosure process and the servicing process. Frauds, as long as they're kept there, will use the skills they developed, and the skills they've developed are making really, really, really bad loans that violate the law. So they are an incredible threat to the system.
It's been more than 3 years since the financial crisis began in earnest, and yet to this point, there's been no major criminal prosecutions of the major players on Wall Street.
Here a week
and I exclude
ago
Bernie
with the
Madoff
Paulson
from
plan.
that list.
It was simple. Give them the keys to the Treasury and suspend all the laws.
The administration has come with a proposal that to me reminds me of roulette. And they're challenging us to just take the bullets.
Once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom, we will rally from the hillside, we will gather from the plain.
Madam Speaker, fundamentally there's something wrong with the way we are proceeding. The arguments use fear to build confidence. We're on an artificial deadline, rushing to judgment, and fearful we can't get there in time.
Like the Iraq War and the Patriot Act, this bill is fueled by fear and hinges on haste. So much is missing. There is no requirement that Wall Street pay a dime.
They made an investment. They took a risk. It didn't turn out well.
The AP poll shows 8 in 10 Americans worry the financial crisis will hit them directly. Despite that, 45% are opposed to the government bailout.
$700 billion is a lot of money.
The largest corporate bailout in American history forever changes the relationship between government and the financial sector.
Madam Speaker, the Constitution of the United States is present to protect Main Street.
We have individuals who were drunk. The regulators were the bartenders who continued to pour the drink, didn't stop him from drinking. And now he was drunk. He got on the main thoroughfare and had an accident. The accident clouds the highway.
We're looking at a symptom.
It's the highway where we have our pension funds.
And we're looking at the collapsing of a market that was unstable. It was unstable because of the way it came about.
It's the highway where we have our car loans and our mortgages.
It came about because of a monopoly control of money and credit by the Federal Reserve System, and that is a natural consequence of what happens when a Federal Reserve System creates too much credit.
The entire bill that they voted on today is actually dead.
And it's failed. We go right to your reaction to the vote in the House. Bloomington, Indiana. Good morning. Good afternoon, rather.
Hello, my name is Justin Morrison, and I'm calling from Bloomington, Indiana, and I oppose this bill along with Ron Paul and all of his other supporters.
And I heard the lady say it again on your show just now, that us common Americans don't get it. I heard Feinstein say that last night. I heard your guest say it just now. I heard your two guests in the last couple of days saying the same thing, that we just don't understand.
The people on top have never had it so good. For the first 7 years of Bush's tenure, the wealthiest 400 individuals in our country saw a $670 billion increase in their wealth.
Congress is being dishonest.
My job is not to get things passed in the House. My job is to get things passed in the Senate. I want to take this time to express my appreciation to my counterpart, Senator McConnell.
For my part, I came to the Senate floor and put down a firm marker. If Congress was going to help companies that got us into this mess, then executives at those companies would play by our rules.
This is not a bailout for Wall Street. It's a bailout for our country. You know, the questions that we should ask, does this bill strengthen America? And it does.
The tone that brought us to this vote this afternoon gets set by the leadership. And if that tone is working in the right direction, a lot of good things can happen.
And that is that we're going to fundamentally change the focus of the economic policy. We're going to focus on the middle class, because it's when the middle class is growing, the economy grows and everybody does well, not just focus on the wealthy.
One of the messages that I have to Congress is get this done.
Democrats, Republicans, step up to the plate, get it done.
I put it on hold last week to fight for a rescue plan that puts you and your economic security and your family and working Americans first.
It's surprising to me that it's gotten essentially no mainstream media coverage at all, because we're talking about so much money.
The Federal Reserve is the black hole in American democracy.
All we have to say is, what do they have to hide?
The Federal Reserve had a responsibility to provide oversight for the conduct of banks. They didn't do that.
It's known as one of the most powerful and secretive institutions in Washington. And now, President Obama wants to hand the Federal Reserve even more power.
I am proposing that the Federal Reserve be granted new authority and accountability for regulating bank holding companies and other large firms that pose a risk to the entire economy in the event of failure.
The president's plan to make the Fed the systemic risk regulator has raised eyebrows on Capitol Hill.
The President's financial reform proposal has included broad and sweeping increases in Chairman Bernanke or his successor's powers. And if that power is used, what will be the oversight?
I believe that we have to adequately audit the Federal Reserve before any consideration is given to making the Federal Reserve the systemic risk regulator.
A growing number in Congress are calling for the Federal Reserve to be fully audited for the first time in its history. It's a movement that started with one Washington outsider, whose ideas have largely been ignored by the mainstream of both political parties. Texas Congressman Ron Paul. He's been trying to audit the Federal Reserve for years without success. But in the last few months, his bill to open up the Fed's books has spawned a rare bipartisan coalition of more than 250 co-sponsors, a majority of the House of Representatives.
The best answer I have about defending my bill is asking a question: why not?
My concern about the legislation is that if the GAO is auditing not only the operational aspects of our programs and the details of the programs, but is making judgments about our policy decisions, that would effectively be a takeover of monetary policy by the Congress, a repudiation of the independence of the Federal Reserve, which would be highly destructive to the stability of the financial system, the dollar, and our national economic situation.
Despite these dire warnings against having an audit, Fed challengers in Congress aren't flinching.
This is a situation where the Federal Reserve is out of control. Since September, it's been doing things it never did before in its history.
With the help of a rule from the days of Woodrow Wilson that gave the Federal Reserve vast authority to lend money during unusual and exigent circumstances, the Fed has doled out more than $1 trillion to financial institutions without consulting Congress. When freshman Congressman Alan Grayson asked the Fed's Inspector General how much of that money the Federal Reserve had lost since the crisis began, he was surprised to find out she didn't know.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
Until we actually look at the program and have the information, we are not in a position to say whether there are losses or to respond in any other way.
And I think it was shocking to me and to other people to see that the Inspector General could not account for $1 trillion of cash that had been handed out by the Federal Reserve in the course of just the past few months.
So Grayson began rallying his fellow Democrats to support Ron Paul's bill and call for more oversight of the Federal Reserve.
The fact is that the American people want to know more of the secrets of the temple, as the book was before you were born. The Secrets of the Temple. It was required reading in my day.
Nancy Pelosi said the public wants to know more about the secrets of the temple. And my response to that is, if the public does learn more, they will be outraged more.
Journalist and author William Greider says the Fed's darkest secrets are conflicts of interest stemming from its deep ties to the financial elite.
The Federal Reserve, from its origins, is very, very close to the biggest banks and financial houses in the country. Always has been and always has governed with that in mind.
The Fed has refused to release the names of all the banks it's given money to, but some of the names that have leaked out have caused concern. And as stories emerge of how the banks got their money, some are questioning the Fed's close relationship with Wall Street.
One example that I think is particularly dubious, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, is involved in the bailout of Bear Stearns. If that firm failed, one of the people who loses first is JP Morgan Chase. So he is also saved by the bailout of Bear Stearns. So he graciously agrees to take over Bear Stearns if the Federal Reserve will put up $30 billion to cover his losses. What I find troubling is that Jamie Dimon sits on the board of directors of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Tim Geithner, who was then president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank and is now Treasury Secretary, was bargaining with his own board member on this terms of this deal. So I think what's happened in this crisis is that people all over the country have been able to see there's something illegitimate about this. They may not be able to put their finger on it, but this doesn't feel right. And some people are getting downright angry, and that includes a lot of members of Congress.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth?
And now one House committee is holding its own investigation into the controversial deal that the Fed brokered between Bank of America and the failing financial giant Merrill Lynch. According to documents acquired during the investigation, Fed Chairman Bernanke threatened to fire Bank of America CEO Ken Lewis when Lewis considered backing out of the deal.
The Fed's decision-making process in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger makes the case for a significant increase in accountability at the Fed.
The next hurdle for the plan to audit the Fed is the House Financial Services Committee, chaired by Barney Frank. Although Frank has praised the Fed's work to keep credit flowing during the economic crisis, he's pledged to include a Fed audit in the major financial regulation bill he plans to finish this summer.
There will be substantially increased auditing. We don't want anything that would endanger the integrity of monetary policy. But in general, the operations of the Fed, the money they take in, all of that will be very much subject to audit.
Despite the momentum, the Fed's not quitting the fight. It just created a new position for Enron's former head lobbyist, Linda Robertson, to push back against congressional critics.
I think it's unfortunate that they're struggling so hard to keep this secret. We need to know exactly who got the money, what the terms are, all the details of this, because this is a democracy. Can't hand out $1 trillion of the people's money and keep everyone in the dark about it. That's ridiculous. Nobody has that kind of power in a democracy in a constitutional country.
Federal Reserve now backstopping $75 trillion of Bank of America's derivatives. Keep in mind, first of all, I heard the statistic this morning. JP Morgan Chase has $2.2 or $2.7 trillion, between $2 and $3 trillion in assets. The entire gross domestic product of the United States right now is a little under $15 trillion. Federal Reserve now backstopping $75 trillion of Bank of America's derivatives. Keep in mind, first of all, I heard the statistic this morning. J.P. Morgan Chase has $2.2 or $2.7 trillion, between $2 and $3 trillion in assets. The entire gross domestic product of the United States right now is a little under $15 trillion. One bank, $2 trillion, more than $2 trillion. But here's where it gets even weirder. The Bank of America, which is in large part actually owned by a Saudi prince, but the Bank of America has $75 trillion worth of derivatives out there. They're still out there. Wells Fargo has $73 trillion out there. Keep in mind, the GDP of the entire planet is $65 trillion. The GDP of the United States is $15 trillion. Each of these banks has over $70 trillion worth of derivatives, and they are in their investment bank branches, which are not backstopped by the FDIC. And what did they do over the last couple of days? And this is what Bloomberg is talking about. They moved them into their commercial banking arms, since now it's all one bank, since we did away with Glass-Steagall, which is protected by both the FDIC and backstopped by the Fed. So now you and I and the Fed are officially backstopping, as far as we know, and you know these are only two of the six banks that own assets equal to 65% of the entire GDP of the United States. But just for these two banks, you and I, via the Fed, are now backstopping $150 trillion worth of bets on bets on bets on bets on bets about mortgages and other things. The entire gross domestic product of our country, $15 trillion, and we're backstopping $150 trillion?
I'm fascinated to know your view on the euro. Do you think it can
Let's refer to what Thomas Jefferson said. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the use of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and Let's refer to what Thomas Jefferson said. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the use of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Stacey Everett.
Max, that sure sounds like what we see in Europe today. The people are being deprived of all their property and are made homeless. But it also applies, of course, to the United States. Mark Faber, Mr. Bernanke, is a murderer of the middle class.
Yes, that's true. Mark Faber is correct. How did he do it? By lowering interest rates artificially down to near zero. Anyone who's on a retirement, pension plan, etc., or has any kind of savings got wiped out to help the bankers. That was the quid pro quo that Bernanke made with the bankers. I'll murder the middle class. You give me huge bonus money and kudos and let me keep this ridiculously stupid job, chairman of the Federal Counterfeiting Bank.
Well, Mark Faber's quote is, if you print money, everything will go up. And now the money printing doesn't go into housing because we have an oversupply of housing, but it goes into equities and for Mr. Bernanke, unfortunately, into commodities. And this is lifting the cost of living of the median household, of the typical household in the U.S. Mr. Bernanke is a murderer. He's a murderer of the middle class and the working class.
Yeah, it's a sad joke because the point of expanding credit as he did was to try to revive the housing bubble. The housing prices keep going down, but now we see bubbles in food and energy. So not only do people live in housing that's going negative equity, but they're paying more for food and energy, and the result is basically economic, financial death. People are now homeless. Middle class is eviscerated because Bernanke is a fool.
Well, you know, his predecessor, Alan Greenspan, in 1966, speaking of quotes, Max, had this to say. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the confiscation of wealth. And this is exactly what we've seen. They act as if it's charity, that the low rates are there to help the working class and the middle class, to get onto the property ladder, to be able to afford these assets. But you see, from Europe all the way to the United States, all throughout the United States, it's this so-called charity which actually helped murder them financially.
Well, look, Greenspan, when he made those comments, he was also talking about how the Fed, through a monetarist policy, could create a dollar standard that was, quote, as good as gold, which is false. There's nothing as good as gold but gold. And when you give someone like Bernanke or Greenspan or the banks on Wall Street the ability to loan money into existence with no collateral, you're giving somebody the ability to counterfeit money, and the result is inflation and hyperinflation. And, of course, Mark Faber is absolutely correct.
You know, all these central bankers are murderers, therefore they're a class of serial killers. And I think Ben Bernanke might be John Wayne Gacy.
Have you ever wondered why Canada is in debt? Have you ever wondered why the government forces Canadians to pay so many taxes? Have you ever wondered why the bankers from the largest private banks are becoming wealthier and the rest of us are not? Have you ever wondered why the gross national Have you ever wondered why Canada is in debt? Have you ever wondered why the government forces Canadians to pay so many taxes? Have you ever wondered why the bankers from the largest private banks are becoming wealthier and the rest of us are not? Have you ever wondered why the gross national debt is over $800 billion? or why we are spending $160 million a day on the interest of the national debt. That's $60 billion a year. Have you ever wondered who receives the $60 billion? What I have discovered is the banks and the government have colluded to financially enslave the people of Canada. I will share with you 3 important points of reference which will hopefully spark enough interest and concern for you to continue the research on your own and to engage your government to stop this criminal act against the people of Canada. First, we will briefly examine the Bank of Canada. Second, we will see how our banking system works today. And lastly, I will offer a viable solution that we can petition our government to implement. A very little known figure in Canadian history is J.O. Gradon McGeer. He was a lawyer, Member of Parliament, and Mayor of Vancouver. His contribution to Canada is probably the greatest in our history. He championed the creation of the National Bank of Canada, whose sole purpose is to create and manage Canada's money. It was formed on July 3, 1934, and owned by all Canadians. Until the 1970s, because of the Bank of Canada, Canada's national debt was held at a constant, manageable level, until the government decided to implement what we now have as our modern-day banking system that is robbing the Canadian people. So how are they robbing us? Allow me to explain how our private banks and government work today. First, the Canadian government borrows money from the private banks. They then lend the debt-based money to Canada with compounded interest. The government then continues to increase taxation of Canadians year after year in order to pay back the interest on the exponentially growing national debt. What results is inflation, thus real money for Canadians to spend into our economy, and the real money being used to pad the pockets of the banks. Also, the government gave the banks the ability to loan out money that doesn't exist in the form of loans. When a bank gives you a mortgage, which literally means a death pledge, or a loan, they don't actually give you money. They click a key on a computer and generate the fake money out of thin air. They don't actually have it in their bank vaults. Presently, the banks only have $4 billion on reserve, but they have loaned out over $1.5 trillion. To quote Graham Towers, each deposits brand new money. Broadly speaking, all new money comes out of a bank in the form of loans. As loans are debt, then under the present system, all money is debt. What I find interesting is even Jesus, in Matthew 21, drove out the money changers in the temple because they were manipulating the currency to steal money from the people. The private banks are just like the money changers of Canada, thus their freedom, and they need to be stopped. How should the banking system work? In an infamous interview, Mr. McGeer asked Mr. Towers, "Can you tell me why a government with power to create money should give that power away to a private monopoly and then borrow that which Parliament can create itself back at interest to the point of national bankruptcy?" Mr. Towers replied, "If Parliament wants to change the form of operating the banking system, then certainly that is within the powers of Parliament. In other words, if the Canadian government needs money, they can borrow it directly from the Bank of Canada. The people would then pay fair taxes to repay the Bank of Canada. This tax money would in turn get injected back into our economic infrastructure and the debt would be wiped out. Canadians would again prosper with real money as the foundation of our economic structure and not debt money. Regarding the debt money owed to the private banks, such as the Royal Bank, we would simply have the Bank of Canada print the money owing, hand it over to the private banks, and then clear the debt with the Bank of Canada. And yes, we have the power and lawful right to do so. In conclusion, it has become painfully obvious, even for me, a 12-year-old Canadian, that we are being defrauded and robbed by the banking system and a complicit government. What will we do to stop this crime? What will we do to ensure that the next generation will live free and clear of the debt-based economy that enslaves them to the banks? Margaret Mead said the following, and I hope that all of you remember this. Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me. Well, let me first start by saying that it was wonderful listening to that 12-year-old who sounds like a very wise and knowledgeable 12-year-old, but the sound quality was poor enough for me that it was very fuzzy, and so I only understood fragments of what she was saying. But it's clear that she was talking about the conventional way that money is created and how it is basically ruining us individually and collectively, and that there must be a better way. And that's a topic very dear to my heart. I've been studying and talking about it and lecturing about it for over 20 years now. My name is Philip Beard. My professional career was spent as a professor of German and in the latter years also of global studies at Sonoma State University. And in the process of that academic career, I taught a lot about matters having to do with violence, institutional violence, because it started with my study of the Holocaust. And I was the director of the Holocaust Studies Center for 3 years in the mid-1980s, rather 1990s. And anyway, from studying and teaching about the Holocaust, I got into the companion lecture series, which was called the War and Peace Lecture Series at Sonoma State, that happened during the spring. The Holocaust lecture series was during the fall. And in both of those lecture series, we all examined lots of examples of mass violence, war, genocide, and scapegoating and stuff like that. And the question that was always behind all of these presentations and at the forefront of everybody's minds is, what is it that actually drives this kind of destructive behavior? And to cut right to the chase here, the conclusion that I finally came to after studying these questions for years was that the prime factor causing destructive behavior, and it's one among many, but it is, I think, the most powerful, is fear of material scarcity. When people are scared that they won't have the money that they need in order to buy the things that they need, in order to lead a dignified and proper life, in order to play their proper role in society, when people are afraid that they won't have those material resources, and in particular that money, they go crazy. And they start scapegoating, they start looking for villains, and they start lashing out. And that lashing out can take small forms, as in domestic violence, parents beating up their kids or beating up on each other. And it extends right up to war and genocide, when people feel threatened enough that they will lash out in anger and in violence at the people whom they see as in some sense competing with them. And the problem, how this all relates to the stuff that you're dealing with here on your live stream is that when you have a monetary system, a dominant monetary system that keeps access to money artificially limited, which keeps money artificially scarce, which is what our dominant monetary system does, and I can explain that in more detail in a few minutes. But when you've got a system that works like that, our institution that is most central to all of our transactions and so many of our efforts at doing the right thing, namely our money, then that puts everyone at risk. And everyone feels that risk, and everyone fears it, even if they don't consciously know what it is that they're afraid of. So this is how I got into the whole question of how money works. And I want to put it now in terms of best practices, because nowadays especially, for the past several years, we've been worried about environmental devastation. We've been worried about global warming, climate change. And recently I participated in a forum that was organized by the city of Santa Rosa about sustainability. And we spent the day hearing from Santa Rosa government agencies and county government agencies and private businesses about how they had tried to move in the direction of greater environmental sustainability and what the best practices were that they had discovered and that they were trying to practice. The main difficulty that all of these people mentioned when they were talking about how they had gotten to the good practices that they were currently using and the better practices that they were looking towards using, the main difficulty that they all talked about was the unavailability of funds for buying solar panels, for example, or filtration systems for the water, or what have you, that it is difficult to find the money to do the things that we know are right. And so in this discussion of best practices, the thing that never came up, except tangentially in my own remarks about the Go Local Cooperative and what we're doing to try to create best practices, the one thing that never came up was whether the money that we're using, the money as it is currently structured, is itself a best practice. And I think that what the 12-year-old Canadian girl was saying makes it clear that the dominant monetary system is not a best practice. As a matter of fact, it is a monolithic institution as opposed to a diverse institution. We have only one kind of money that we're used to using and that we think of as being really the only responsible kind that exists. They call it legal tender, and that terminology leads us to sometimes assume that any other kind of money is illegal, but that's not true. Legal tender is just the bills that the Fed supplies us with, and it says on the bill that this is legal tender for all debts, public and private. But this is not to say that all other forms of money are therefore illegal. Checks, for example, are not legal tender, but we use them all the time. Credit cards are not legal tender, but we use them all the time. And so what we need to look at is what sorts of money we can develop that will maintain our prosperity, that will continue to work as an effective lubricant for our commercial transactions, but which will not put us into this terrible hole that we have gotten into, that the young lady was describing, of where we can't pay our bills anymore because so much of our money has been sucked away into the accounts of the big banks, the accounts of the big financiers who want nothing more than to increase their monetary holdings, and they don't care what real value is compromised or stolen from the people as they do that. So I think maybe you should ask me some questions, CJ, about where we're going and what we think can be done to address this whole this intensely problematic and threatening situation that we find ourselves in, with our economy having bombed out in 2008 and looking like it's on its way to doing it again.
Thanks. I'll try. I'm having some trouble. People have been instant messaging me, so it is working, that there is some difficulty with hearing sound. Hopefully you can hear my questions. So what I think we need to really grasp is, what are our options? What can we do? And what are you doing now yourself to try to shift public awareness to this matter?
Well, I think first, to answer the question of what are our options, we have to recognize that money nowadays, the way it is currently being created and used, is credit. The money that we have in our wallets, in our pockets, in our purses, is not a commodity that we have somehow gained. What it is a loan, and it has to be paid back. You know, it's created by private banks. The Fed, as a matter of fact, is a consortium of private banks, and it issues the rules whereby commercial banks and investment banks and so on can create money. And they all do it by one essential mechanism, and that is debt. And you're well aware of the book, the wonderful book by Ellen Brown called Web of Debt, in which she describes in beautiful historical detail how this system has come about. But the issuance of money as debt has come to monopolize our thinking about how we can finance the things that we need. We say to ourselves, well, if the money's not there, then we can't do it. And the result of that is that businesses don't expand when they would like to, that governments have to cut back on the services that they normally are expected to provide, such as good roads and good police and fire departments and other governmental services, mental health, and on and on. You know, we have cut back on these things, always with the sort of hand-wringing excuse that, gosh, we can't do anything about this until the economy turns around, because until that happens, the money just isn't there to fund these things. Okay, well, that's going on the assumption that you have to have the money in your hand or in your account before you can spend it on the things that you need to spend it on in order to maintain our society at the level it would like to be at. But there's another way of looking at the way at finance. You can lend money into existence, which is what is currently being done. And it's being done, as the young lady pointed out, at compound interest, which is, to my mind, the real villain of the piece. You can lend it into existence, which is what the banks are doing. Or, and this is what I propose we should start doing in a much bigger way, you can spend it into existence. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are valuable things that we need to buy. We need to buy, let's just take one simple example that probably everybody agrees upon, and that's roads. We need to have good roads. Currently here in Sonoma County, our roads suck. They have gotten so bad, and our county supervisors have even gone so far as to say, we're only going to maintain a certain relatively small percentage of them, I think it's 40% or something like that, at their full, in their proper state, and we're going to let the rest basically deteriorate until they turn back into dirt. This is crazy. This is crazy. This is value that we're losing because we say the money's not there to maintain it. But we can create that money. We can create it by spending it into existence rather than asking for a loan from banks that will charge us an arm and a leg to give us to let us use their money. We can create our own. And how would that look? It's a simple idea, and it's called credit clearing. The idea is that if you've got, say, a government that wants to improve its roads, it says to the contractors, look, we don't have the money, the dollars, to pay you as much as you would as you demand, but we still want to hire you, and we'll pay you the amount of dollars that we have, and we'll make up the difference with our own credits. We'll call them, let's just call them Sonoma County credits for the sake of the argument. And with these Sonoma County credits, we expect you to complete the job for us that we would otherwise be unable to hire you to do. Why would you be willing to accept these credits that are not quite the same thing as US dollars? I mean, they're not US dollars, but they are valuable money. They are our own credit. The reason that you would be likely to accept it is that we have this network of businesses, local and regional businesses, that are willing to accept some portion of the price that they charge in these credits. Why are they willing to do that? Because we, the County of Sonoma, are willing to accept these credits back in the payments of taxes and fees and other things that people have to pay the county for. So it's a simple idea. We create the money in the sense of it's a representation of the value that we are buying from you, and our obligation by having accepted that service that you're providing us and the goods and services that you're providing us, our obligation is to accept that same credit that we have issued when people come back with it to us, paying us for whatever it is that they have to pay us for.
This is like a weaning off of the US dollar. We're weaning ourselves away into our own exchange of value.
That's right. And I like the weaning symbol that you've chosen for it, because it is a gradual process. We're not talking about some kind of a revolution that would throw out the US dollar. That's not the idea. The US dollar may remain forever useful in certain ways, but currently, as the only form of money that we've got at our disposal, there's a whole bunch of needs that it is not filling. We have to complement the dollar with these other forms of money, this self-generated credit, in order to be able to do the things that we tell ourselves we need.
And we could also establish public banks, which could actually create credit.
Yes, that's the level of operation that Ellen Brown is promoting most actively, together with Mark Armstrong of the Public Banking Institute. And they're doing wonderful work, and I support that idea 100%. It's been demonstrated for us how well it works. We're not reinventing the wheel with this idea. The state of North Dakota has had its own public bank ever since 1919. And it is instructive to recognize that the state of North Dakota is the only state of the 50 that is currently not running a budget deficit. Their public bank has been issuing low or no interest loans to farmers, to students, and to its own government ever since 1919. And it functions like the young lady from Canada was talking about. That needs to be done. However, we don't need, I think it's great that the effort is ongoing to make that happen. And there are lots of states that are now considering the formation of their own public banks. And that campaign, I think, is entirely worth our support. Meanwhile, it's not the only approach that we can take. As everyone will recognize who's ever paid any attention to state level politics, we've got the same problem in Sacramento, potentially at least, as we do in Washington, namely lawmakers who are in the hip pocket of rich corporations who are going to oppose the formation of a state bank because it's going to basically eat their lunch. So,
but we can focus on county level and city level public banks, because they could set them up for their own communities and create credit for their own infrastructure needs right now, even without, often I talk about the eminent domain of the loans to give them extra capital assets. The fact is, every county, every city already has capital assets. They have land and buildings and cash accounts, pension funds that they could all use to capitalize a public bank and start creating credit for public benefit instead of this complete fiat credit creation that lines the bankers' pockets while it steals everything from everybody else.
You're absolutely right. The county could do it. Getting people, in particular our elected representatives, to think along those lines, however, is a very difficult task. And it's a frustrating task. You know, I've been up against it for the better part of 20 years now, trying to even get people to think about the question of whether the money that we've currently got is a best practice. But now that we've seen so much go down the tubes as a result of the financial crash of 2008 and the follow-on events, you know, with all of the bailouts and the buyouts and the too big to fail banks and all of that, we have got to recognize that there's something essentially and basically wrong with the system. And the good news is that there are more people recognizing that now than did before 2008. In particular, the Occupy movement has focused on these destructive and unsustainable practices that the big financiers are engaged in, and the extent to which those financiers control control our governmental policymaking. And since more people are aware of that now, and more people are talking about it, I agree with you, CJ, that we can put into motion here a snowball thing, something, you know, that will go viral, I hope, and I confidently assume it will go viral once enough people realize that the existing system is flawed, inherently and fundamentally flawed, and that we have alternatives to it, and that public banking is a concept that makes eminent good sense. It's constitutionally provided for. You know, we get to do what we want to as a society with our money. Oh, and that brings up this interesting, relatively recent issue of the trillion-dollar platinum coin. And now the White House has said, no, that's off the table. The Treasury is not going to issue this trillion-dollar coin. Why? Because the Fed has told us that they won't accept it as valid value. Is this the tail wagging the dog, or is it just me? Seems to me the government, according to the Constitution, gets to coin its money and gets to define the value of that coinage. And so we can do this. It's entirely legal. And if it makes sense, in order to avoid, you know, this fiscal cliff and this debt limitation thing, then why don't we just do it? After all, it has been done in the past.
Absolutely. And I want to, we've got to go. We've run out of time. We thank you for watching, but I want to leave you, all of you, with this. It's been 100 years since the Federal Reserve was put in place. I think the perfect anniversary is to start auditing and moving it off the scene. I love Philip's idea of migrating, weaning ourselves off, and also the public banks. Literally, we need to make sure that the creation of credit, which I hope you've got by now, is just clicking a computer key and you've got another $1 trillion. It's completely out of control with hundreds of trillions of dollars in derivatives that are completely uncontrolled, and yet we're on the hook for some way, shape, or form. I hope you understand that this is just the foreclosure crisis, all the fraud, just like William Black shared with us. It's just rolling. It's going to roll. It rolled from mortgage fraud to foreclosure fraud to derivatives. It's just going to continue to mushroom and roll until we stop it. It's like a bully, and it's like a thief. When they go into the store, they just keep stealing until they're stopped. So we have to stop that. And I think the 100 years of the Federal Reserve is a really good time to start. Just remember, everybody's been bought off. It's not a Republican and a Democrat issue. They're playing their own party. They wanted a two-party game. They've left the people out. They've left us out, and it's up to the people to make a change. We appreciate you watching, and we're going to be bringing these ideas back again and again. Thank you. This is CJ Holmes, founder of Homeowners for Justice, signing off.